Hi, everyone. Thank you for being here tonight. My name is Kylie Stein, and I am the Assistant Director of Special Events and Donor Stewardship here at Wabash. I joined the team back in September, and I'm so excited to be with all of you tonight for this After the Bell session. We are going to hear a presentation from Professor Daniel D'Amico and then do a Q&A session at the end. Feel free to put questions in the chat as the conversation goes, but we'll hold all of those for the end, and Professor D'Amico will address them at the end of the presentation. For some background, Daniel D'Amico is the director of the Stephenson Institute for Classical Liberalism here at Wabash, an associated faculty member as well. Prior to joining Wabash in 2022, Professor D'Amico served for 8 years as the Associate Director of the PPE Center at Brown University and as an Associate Professor of Economics at Loyola University, New Orleans prior to that. His research primarily focuses on comparative institutional analysis, intellectual history, and political economy. His research has been published in international outlets, including the Journal of Comparative Economics, Public Choice, the Journal of Economic Behavior and Organization, and Public Affairs Quarterly. He is the current co-editor of Advances in Austrian Economics and a member of the Royal Society for the Encouragement of Arts, Manufacturers, and Commerce. And for tonight's After the Bell session, he will be giving a presentation titled All Roads Lead from Wabash, How the Little Giants of Liberal Arts Shaped Classical Liberal Scholarship. So thank you for being here, Professor D'Amico, and we are excited to hear more from you.
Thank you so much for the kind introduction, Kylie. All of that information about myself is true. So I'm relatively new here at Wabash. This is coming on the conclusion of my third year. And in being in a new position, I interact with my professional network beyond Wabash and on campus, and I'm frequently confronted with a question of, well, why did you apply for this role and why did you accept it and come to Wabash? And that sort of is the background narrative of a lot of my comments that I have for us this evening. Two primary reasons motivated my interest in this position with the Stephenson Institute and Wabash College. First and foremost was that the Stephenson Institute for Classical Liberalism has classical liberalism baked into its name. And this is an intellectual tradition that deeply is at the core of my own research agenda on typically topics of political economy and especially questions surrounding the role of government and mass incarceration. I only know of one other academic organization at a university with classical liberalism in its name, and that's run out of New York University's law school by friends and colleagues Mario Rizzo and Richard Epstein. And their rationale is that classical liberalism is very much the intellectual root of the American common law tradition. And so they see it as sort of nourishing the soul of intellectual history in their legal education. And I deeply resonate with that mission and believe that many of the ideas of the classical liberal tradition are at the core of our entire civilizational history. And tragically enough, it's a sort of under-recognized intellectual field in the academy today. So when I saw that there was a new institute coming down the pipeline here at Wabash, I was sort of eager to learn more about it. And second, I knew a bit about Wabash's history in conjunction with classical liberalism, largely because I have deep connections with a variety of organizations, including the Foundation for Economic Education, the Institute for Humane Studies, Liberty Fund, and the Mont Pelerin Society, many of which we'll hear a bit more about as my presentation unfolds. In short, the legacies of Ben Rogie and Pierre Goodrich are very prominent features in all of these institutional histories. And so to be able to be a part of this new center here at Wabash sounded like a great opportunity and one that I really wanted to be a part of. And since being here, what I've come to learn is that my own vision of the role of education in society and a vision of liberal arts, as well as my own understanding of what liberalism means and the intellectual tradition of classical liberalism, I've discovered in real time that I owe primarily to Wabash College. And that's the sort of narrative that I want to sort of talk about today. And in particular, this role of Wabash's prominent vision, this meaningful intellectual endeavor and conversation about what education means for the individual and their role in society and how to actually go about doing it. It was sort of in the air in the mid 20th century here at Wabash College. And I want to sort of survey a bit of that intellectual history because I'm not the only one whose worldview of classical liberalism and their own educational mission is framed in this way. And to be here and learn about this deep intellectual history has been really inspiring for me to sort of share with a broader professional network of how important our small liberal arts college has been in shaping this research agenda. So, as a nerdy academic, I can't help but begin with some definitional material. So, in a liberal arts environment, people are often entrusted with this responsibility of explaining what it means to be a liberal arts institution, what a liberal arts education means. And so I've got 5 different terms here on the slide: classical education, liberal arts, liberalism in terms of like a political doctrine or modern political liberalism, classical liberalism, and then classical liberal arts. Now, if I were you, or if I was sort of explaining this to a buddy who isn't necessarily an academic or an intellectual, or my parents, I think that they would read this list and say, you just said the same words, but rearrange them in a number of different ways. Isn't this all just kind of the same thing? In contrast, if you were to talk to someone, say, about the meaningful verbiage of liberal arts versus the meaningful verbiage of classical liberalism, most people committed to either of those two things would say, totally different meanings. We don't mean the same thing. They're super different. Similarly, if you talk to someone about contemporary or modern understandings of liberal as a political identity versus a classical liberal, they would say, whoa, 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 we mean very different things, even though we're using the same word. And I guess a way to think about a thesis for this presentation is that the normal person's hunch, the knee-jerk reaction of, well, these are all sort of the same words, so they all must have some similar meaning. I want to defend that a little bit. I want to say that while the distinctiveness of these different concepts is not unreasonable, there is still a very strong reason why they all seem to leverage the same semantics and the same etymology and shared history of a meaningful concept. They all rely upon a shared conceptual or essential foundation. And again, Wabash is at the core of that history of these terms coming into definition, at least in the 20th century in the American experience. So, to begin, the phrase classical education, long story short, I just plugged these terms into Oxford's English Dictionary. And under classical education, we have a reference point to the definitional concept of classical education that I think most people are pretty familiar with is that, well, we're not just trying to transmit information, we're trying to sort of curate a potential for character development of a whole person, that we want people to be well-rounded and sort of equipped to manage their lives in a variety of different ways and contexts. And so one thing that comes to mind when looking at these dictionary definitions is that they're both accurate in some ways, but also often somewhat reactionary. They're defined by contrast, right? Like, oh, education in broad general concepts rather than vocational norms per se. And again, I think missing out on this is a bit of an essentialist or a conceptual core. Um, Long story short, I think that there's a bit of missing meaning to the concept of liberty in some of these dictionary definitions. So, beyond classical education, we get to liberal arts, and liberal arts is often defined, again, sociologically as what liberal arts curriculum tend to entail. And this, again, dates back to sort of antiquity insofar as the general subject matters of grammar and rhetoric and logic, arithmetic, geometry, music, and astronomy. Those were the sort of like ancient components of a liberal arts education. Um, Liberalism in its apart from the educational project, just a sort of intellectual tradition or a political philosophy, has divergent meanings as well. So we have modern liberalism in terms of freedom from bias, prejudice, or bigotry, open-mindedness, tolerance, is typically associated with left-wing politics in the American experience. But in the British experience, the Liberal Party, so to speak, has a stronger appreciation of legal equality, civil rights, property ownership, and free markets and economic freedom as well. So, in that sense, the Brits use this term in its more classical origins relative to modern origins. And essentially, what I want to say is that there's a shared usage of libertas in the liberal arts tradition as there is in classical liberalism. And in particular, that has implications and meaning for how we should think about what the role and structure of higher education can be in society. And it also has like sort of curricular design implications as well. Um, and so, again, even in the definition of terms like liberalism, we see this pattern of divided meanings in virtually every political doctrine. Republicanism, for example, there's a party called the Republican Party, but it is far afield from things that, say, Machiavelli or Burke or Russell Kirk would have theorized and written about. Uh, the core elements of the classical liberal tradition, or the main thing separating classical liberalism, I think, from alternative semantic definitions of liberalism today, is twofold. One is a recognition of the role of what's called spontaneous orders. The idea that society, in its complexity and its functioning, is primarily the outcome of unplanned interactions of autonomous and freely choosing people, individuals per se. And second is this focus on individuals as the primary unit of analysis, that individual human beings have distinctive characteristic features and a human nature that doesn't necessarily replicate at the collective level. In this vein, it begs a question as to what does a classical liberal arts education look like? This is a photo of Alexis de Tocqueville. One of my favorite quotes is, "Nothing is more wonderful than the art of being free, but nothing is harder to learn how to use than freedom." And here I view Tocqueville as really putting explicitly the visionary mission of and complementarity between classical liberalism and liberal arts. My students have this tendency in modern times. There's a catchphrase where they're saying, "I'm an academic weapon," and they view themselves as being sort of fully engaged in their learning, and they've leveled up their character in the video game of life, and they're ready to sort of take on new challenges in a sort of aggressive and uh, 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 offensive form. And I think that there's a lot of intuitive truism to that turn of phrase. And what I found myself saying is that, well, we know what the turn of phrase martial arts means, right? Martial arts are a set of skills that can train someone to be a samurai or a ninja, a sort of warrior equipped with these skills and practices of the different martial arts. Liberal arts, I would suggest, is a set of skills and insight designed and sort of curated so that people could be free thinking and acting individual citizens. And there's a baked in implication that that has good and freeing effects on the society writ large. And so a free thinking mind effectively leads to a free thinking individual and a free and peaceful and prosperous society. That martial arts are to ninjas as liberal arts are to free and capable citizens. Um, and this naturally begs a question as to, well, from this committed centering, right, we've adopted the phrase at the Stephenson Institute, freedom studies, which is sort of a tongue-in-cheek recognition of the popularity of area studies today. There's regional studies like North American studies or South American studies, Asian studies, Latin American studies. There's identity-based studies, gender studies, women's studies. There's identity marker or ethnic studies, things like Black studies, like at the Malcolm X Institute, et cetera. Freedom studies is basically a similar concept where the central motivating question and the central motivating topic is this question of human liberty. I think classical liberalism as an intellectual movement is basically arguing that freedom and individual liberty is the most explanatory variable when you're looking at all of the complex processes and changes of society, that they're arguably shaped and conditioned by whether or not individual rights are recognized and protected, and whether or not they ebb and flow in different places and times. So last is a recognition that there's a sort of obviousness of a curriculum, that the original core subject areas of liberal arts were a product of their historical time and place, that those were subject areas that were meaningful and useful for individuals to be able to navigate their society. And today, we've like this openness of the curriculum leaves room for evolution and adaptation, that the curriculum and the disciplinary boundaries sort of naturally fall in place. Well, an individual trying to navigate and author their lives in a society is going to need to know the obvious basic building blocks of physical sciences, mathematics, and then also the ability to communicate and to familiarize oneself with history. And in particular, there's a heavy emphasis on social science, how the world works, what are the cause and effect relationships of individuals choosing and engaging in commerce and cultural exchange and travel and languages, right? All of the sort of liberal arts curriculum falls into place when you recognize that there's this intention to assisting and equipping people in the pursuit of individual freedom and a free society. Furthermore, this begs a question as to, well, what does the organization of a college or university institution look like when motivated by this model? And that question, again, is at the heart of conversations amongst Wabash faculty and administration in the heart of the 20th century. And furthermore, as I'll argue later, is incredibly profound and almost clairvoyant about many of our contemporary political challenges regarding higher education. And in other words, the critical leaders and luminaries of Wabash College were engaged in a intentional project of designing an institution that could serve this role. And furthermore, that had everything from its financial model, its governance structure, and its curricular apparatus unified and cohesive in these visions. And again, the conversation was sort of started by Wabash. It had influence at other institutions around the world that is still felt today. And it's I'm blown away on a weekly basis about the information that keeps getting sort of thrown at me about the intellectual history of Wabash College in the classical liberal tradition. And so, really, what I want to do is sort of share some of those findings with everyone. A name and face I assume many in our audience are well familiar with is obviously Ben Rogie. So, Ben Rogie was a faculty member at Wabash College from 1949 to 1980, and the dean of the college from 1955 to 1964. His scholarship is limited in its publication, but profound in its implication. What I mean by that is he wrote a book and published in 1979, Can Capitalism Survive? Again, when I assign it and sort of work with students around it, they think it must have been written a decade ago, because the topics and tensions that he points out and sort of argues in favor of is at the heart of many of our contemporary issues. There's almost nothing new under the sun in that sense. A bit of amazing lore for people who are more familiar with classical liberalism is how significant Ben Rogie really was in much of the subsequent inspirational role of classical liberal research and appreciation that took place since. Milton Friedman's Capitalism and Freedom, which is sort of a core text of influence and major popularity in this intellectual tradition, was originally delivered as a series of lectures here at Wabash College under Ben Rogie's invitation to Milton Friedman to attend campus in 1956 and eventually published in 1962. 1968, Ben Rogie coordinated Ludwig Erhard to come to campus to deliver a series of lecture, and actually helped coordinate an entire sort of Western Hemisphere tour. For those of you guys who don't know, Ludwig Erhard was the chief economic advisor for Germany in the wake of World War II to try to cure hyperinflation. And he was incredibly successful at doing that and traveled across the Western countries talking about his economic policy advice. It would be like the equivalent of having Powell come to Wabash today. It really gives a vision as to like how significant and high stakes the conversations at Wabash were. I want to share a brief anecdote, something that came up. One of the things that Ben Rogie worked on in 1971, he coordinated in conjunction with Pierre Goodrich a seminar, Education in a Free Society. He wrote a leading paper. It became eventually published in a book in the Liberty Fund catalog. In attendance at this conference were representatives of major universities across the country at the time, in particular, Hillsdale College, Grove City College, and a gentleman, Manuel Ayau, who went on immediately from that conference to establish an entire college based off of a similar dynamic model as Wabash in Guatemala City. That college is referred to as University Francisco Marroquin. Its entire curriculum is geared around the concept of classical liberalism. Its financial model is completely private, independent of government subsidy or regulation. I recently began collaborating with Lenore Ely, who's one of their top administrative faculty currently, and we've got a series of paper projects and research projects that we're working on. And so I had the opportunity last year to visit their campus and bring a number of students along with us. This is kind of an amazing story, but worth sharing. Lenore's administrative assistant at University Francisco Marroquin is Manuel's granddaughter. And she mentioned in correspondence when she was sort of booking the logistics for our trip, she said, "Oh, my father went to Wabash College." And I said, "Wow, that's remarkable." So I immediately went over and spoke to Nolan in our archives. And I said, "Can you find me anything you can about this gentleman who went to Wabash College during these years?" And he came back from the Rogie file And as it turned out, um, this was Manuel's son-in-law. So his daughter was dating a college student. He went to a nightclub, and when he exited, him and his friends were trying to get back in their car, but all of the tires had been flattened. And they were attacked by a group of paramilitary communists. And Manuel's son-in-law was fighting back because he had trained in karate a little bit. And they shot him in both legs and kidnapped him. And he fought his way out of the kidnappers. And Manuel wrote a letter to Ben Rogie saying, I have to get this kid out of the country because they're going to kill him, because they know what he looks like and he knows what they look like. We have the telegraph of Ben Rogie 12 days later saying he's arrived, he's enrolled in classes, and everybody loves him. He's my personal academic advisee. When visiting UFM, I got to have a meal with this man and a number of students there as well. And the first things out of his mouth were, Wabash College saved my life. Ben Rogie, what a guy. Like, Rogie seemed to sort of live and breathe a dedicated focus to the educational project of classical liberalism. And it had profound effects on shaping an entire other college in Guatemala City, but also many other institutions around the globe, and virtually the pedagogical focus of hundreds of academics that work today. And it's remarkable because I think a lot of people don't even recognize this or realize it. Another major luminary, the sort of like behind the scenes character to Ben Rogie, and many of you might be familiar with as well, is John Van Sickle. They wrote an economics textbook together. Van Sickle was faculty from 1946 to 1961. John Van Sickle was integral in processing the passport and visa paperwork for luminary economists Ludwig von Mises and F.A. Hayek, who went on to win the Nobel Prize, so that they could come to the States and flee Nazi Germany. Weirdly enough, that's basically the equivalent, in my view. That means that John Van Sickle is the closest thing to Batman that exists. This is number 11, Winter 98, the Batman Chronicles. This issue is about Batman being deployed to rescue Ludwig von Mises's personal library from Nazis, which is to say that the closest correlate to this behavior was John Van Sickle. Students love that anecdote. Van Sickle's influence, I've gotten the opportunity to thumb through much of his textbook. He clearly was deeply engaged on this critical focus about the role of social science in the liberal arts curriculum and how prominent of importance economic analysis was in understanding how individuals have potential to coordinate their behaviors with other people in a complex and diversified society through trade and exchange. Another major luminary, which I had no idea he even taught at Wabash College. It was merely for a year in 1962 to 1963, or I'm sorry, 1976. No, that's not correct. 1962 and 63 as well. Ralph Rako is a preeminent historian of the Austrian and classical liberal traditions. He was actually a close friend of mine. I met him when I was an undergrad because he was delivering a series of lectures about a book he was working on. And Ralph Rako is of historical significance because in close proximity to his departure from Wabash College, he had written his dissertation under F.A. Hayek at the University of Chicago. He was clearly in communication with Ben Rogie by means of the Hayek connection and the relationship that Rogie had built with the University of Chicago. And so he came to Wabash. Prior to living in Crawfordsville, the smallest city that Ralph had ever lived in was Paris, France. And so he wasn't necessarily long for Indiana countryside, but he went on to write the first gay rights platform of a national political party in American history in 1976, not 2010. like way ahead of the curve in terms of advocating explicitly for the decriminalization of homosexual behavior and civic equality of marriage rights for gays. I don't think that that's necessarily coincidental that that vision came out of this network of scholarship. Similarly, Baldy Harper worked at Cornell for a number of years. He founded an organization called the Institute for Humane Studies. The Institute for Humane Studies is currently operating out of George Mason University, and its explicit commitment when Baldy founded it and for 50 years subsequently was that they wanted to be a resource center for assisting and supporting scholarship in the classical liberal tradition. And so it was about discovering and recognizing talent across intellectual disciplines and putting them in touch with people who had navigated the profession previously, how to turn your dissertation into a book, how to get in conversation with other people in your field working on similar topics, and to make sure that the relevant literature and findings of the cutting edge material was at your disposal. IHS has helped thousands of scholars around the globe, including myself and many peers and friends, help launch their careers and refine their research output as scholars in the classical liberal tradition. Now, Baldy began IHS in 1961, and I wonder, you're probably having the same question as me. Why do they call him Baldy? He doesn't look that bald. Apparently, his brother had lots of hair, and everybody nicknamed his brother Baldy, ironically. And FA had less hair than his brother, and it just stuck, and he was like Baldy Jr. And this happened when he was 12, and it lasted up until he died. And everybody endearingly referred to him as Baldy. But he begins IHS in 1961, began a brand new organization. It was centered out of his garage in California, Menlo Park. And instead of the next year working in location, he spent the next year guest teaching at Wabash College, largely because he wanted to sort of benchmark best practices. He wanted to say, okay, well, this is the closest thing to the vision that I'm trying to facilitate and develop in new talent. People refer to Harper as teaching the teachers, so to speak. And he tied in to the conversation that was going on at Wabash College because that's what he saw as the obvious, like, replicable blueprint. Last and probably most significantly was Pierre Goodrich. Pierre Goodrich was a graduate of Wabash College, and then also a board of trustee member. Goodrich went on to found Liberty Fund, which is centered in Carmel, Indiana. And probably his most obvious lasting legacy here on campus is the Goodrich Seminar Room. And a lot of people don't understand the inherent symbolism of the Goodrich Seminar Room. This is him during its design phase. The Goodrich Seminar Room looks like a pretty sophisticated seminar room, something you would see in a library. But upon closer inspection, one realizes that the limestone walls are etched with a number of symbols and names tracing a complicated timeline that begins with this image, which is now the logo for Liberty Fund. It's Sumerian cuneiform dating to 2300 BC, Mesopotamia, the sort of earliest evidence environment of human civilization. The literal translation is something like return to mother. Goodrich identified it as the first written example of the word liberty in human existence. The remainder of the walls in the Goodrich room are adorned with the names of individuals who Goodrich believed made meaningful and lasting contributions to our understanding of human freedom and individual liberty over the course of civilizational history leading up to the Scottish Enlightenment, surrounding classical liberal thinkers like Blackstone, Adam Smith, Kant, Hume, Burke, and the Declaration of Independence. Now, in other words, Goodrich viewed this as a syllabus. In fact, it's very explicit because he wrote a memorandum of advising a syllabus for students to engage in Socratic dialogue around these texts in the seminar room, specifically aimed at advising Wabash College when he was a Board of Trustees member. Liberty Fund still prints, or there's access to those documents in the Liberty Fund catalog. The design features of the room had a twofold intention. One is that the timeline is meant to obviously convey to the people in the room that the quest to understand and appreciate liberty is as long as human civilization itself. And that it's that primary task and responsibility that is what learning is all about. And furthermore, the room is meant to be intimidating. It's meant to be a great task, a sort of intellectual responsibility to conduct further. Now, some people would observe, well, why does everything stop with the Enlightenment? Why does everything stop at 1776? The entire point is that we engaged in discussion and reading the texts and keeping ideas alive is the subsequent conversation. Liberty Fund is imbued with a very similar mission. In fact, the exterior of their corporate headquarters has the same timeline etched in limestone around it, but they do two primary functions. They print books, the books that are attached to this syllabi, because the books are so important, they're too important to let fall out of print. Liberty Fund, endowed with Goodrich's legacy fortunes, is capable of taking a loss on the printing costs in order to make sure that people have reliable access to these texts for scholarship, for personal consumption. And then secondly, Liberty Fund has hosted over 6,000 Socratic discussions beyond the conventional undergraduate academic environment. They have these conversations with professional intellectuals, professional lay people, business people, legal practitioners. It's really bridging the Socratic potential into general society. And like I said, virtually every academic I know beyond Wabash who's had the experience of interacting with Liberty Fund and has tacit appreciation for classical liberalism has co-opted the organizational model of the Socratic dialogue that Goodrich set in place and that the Liberty Fund sort of showcases and advertises across its various seminars. Now, this isn't an entire story. These individuals, trustees and faculty and visiting guest scholars were supported and complemented by administration at the time. In particular, Frank Sparks from 1941 to 1956 viewed the financial independence of academic institutions as critical to preserving academic freedom and the curricular approach to a liberal arts education. In 1976, when the Sparks Center was named, Thaddeus Seymour made these connections explicitly, arguing that commitment to the free society and free enterprise was a critical component that must be represented on the faculty at Wabash in the present and moving forward, and heralded Sparks's commitment to this financial independence potential as sort of visionary. And I would argue explicitly that, like, again, today's challenges of, well, we have a governmental apparatus which is sort of stepping beyond its appropriate roles, putting its finger in the pot and sort of dictating or restricting or regulating the content of educational experience. I mean, I'm not advocating that Wabash College should necessarily mimic or replicate everything that Hillsdale does. It seems that Hillsdale is in a good position, as is Wabash, is in a good position relative to lots of other colleges around the country because of the conversations that were being had about the relationship between free individuals, a free society, and a liberal education in the mid-20th century, and that we're enjoying many of the dividends from that conversation and commitment and visionary approach today. And I think, it's an interesting phenomenon where most of the academy has been taking its inspiration from elite institutions for a very long while. And yet, I mean, I say with full sincerity, having reread recently Education in a Free Society, the Goodrich memorandums, Ben Rogi's commentaries about financing higher education and the roles of students and responsibilities and individual responsibilities of being a student committed to educating themselves, I think a lot of our educational infrastructure would benefit greatly from reading these historic dialogues and renewing that appreciation in a conversation, because it matters today almost more than ever. With that, I'd love to field questions and perhaps have a conversation with any of our audience members.
Awesome. Thank you, Professor D'Amico.
My pleasure,
Yeah,
Tyler.
everyone feel free to drop questions in the chat and we will be able to field them and discuss.
Well, I've been especially enamored with the most recent of your comments, Dr. D'Amico, because those men you mentioned were as you know, from my history, they were my mentors when I was at Wabash. I was Baldy Harper Senior Fellow, for example, in the development of the Institute for Humane Studies. Rayco was a good friend. Well, thank you for reminding me of the good times old Dick Stephenson had at Wabash College.
My pleasure, Dick, and thank you so much for your generous support. It's really a treat. David Blix is on faculty now, and he also got to take classes with Ralph Rayco. And it's funny because I'm so new here, and most people just assume that David Blix came with the school, and it's a thing that we have in common, to be able to reminisce about knowing Ralph as a person and how kind he was. I mean, he's just like acerbic humor and wit. In many ways, I didn't realize when I first met him and got to interact with him, but he was so Wabash, even though he had a limited window here on campus. But having experienced more of the personalities of people on campus, like, you can see them reminiscent in a lot of our older guard intellectuals, for sure.
I unfortunately came to my economics major halfway through my career at Wabash and only got to take one course with Ben Rogi. But I do recall fondly when he invited Milton Friedman to campus for a lecture.
Well, if you only had one class, we know that the marginal value must have been really high.
Yeah. I did stay with economics, not professionally, but it's always stood me in good stead. And I think I got a balanced view at Wabash. Learned the liberal Keynesian stuff, but also the much more important classical.
I mean, what I think is super important about a liberal arts, like, I like economics nested within a liberal arts tradition, precisely for the balance that you're talking about. Deirdre McCloskey is an academic currently practicing still, deeply enmeshed in classical liberalism. But she's pointed out that in the earlier part of the 20th century, most undergraduate curriculum was primarily history of thought. When you took a physics class, you were learning about the wrong physics that people used to believe and how the ideas changed over time. And when you take a liberal arts approach to learning economics, you have to learn about the different things that were happening in the world and how our theorists came to believe they were explained, and then the debates that took place about how to interpret who was right and wrong and what we should be doing in terms of policy to either fix or not intervene. And so, yeah, if all you're doing is taking economics as a series of technical models in order to bring into a boardroom or the Senate floor, you're really losing sight on, well, where theory came from and what historical events shaped what we now think we understand. And so, I mean, to me, the grand debate of the 20th century, socialism versus capitalism, Hayek versus Keynes, this is sort of, not to say that Keynes is a socialist, but like, these are distilled analogous debates of one another. Marx and Adam Smith, Keynes and Hayek.
Yeah, I recall a discussion in intermediate macro, I think it was, where the instructor was asking for the question was this a political issue or an economic issue?
Mm-hmm.
And I said, but politics is economics. And his response immediately was, oh, you've read Marx. And I had not read Marx, but I came away from that thinking, well, Marx was no dummy. He just started with the wrong assumptions.
Fair enough. Kylie, are you curating Q&A?
Yeah, looks like we do have a question from the chat.
Sure.
I have a quick
go
question.
Yeah.
Sorry. First off, it's happy to hear that Dr. Blix has reached Hall Peeble levels of he has been there since the founding of Wabash. Secondly, in reading Why Liberty, it seems like it really relates to 1940s and 50s idea of the current day libertarianism and anarchism in ways of why are we letting these imperfect people govern us, and the idea of how can we allocate our personal rights to other people when we don't have those rights over our neighbors or other things. It kind of gets in the idea. There's a book out there by Dominic Scarcella called Good Neighbor, Bad Citizen. It's very New Testament, very Jesus oriented. However, it's the idea of being good neighbors, but we don't particularly have to participate in the outside government that kind of lords over us. Is it, or did I just imply way too much into this pamphlet?
I'm not as familiar with the Good Neighbors text that you're referring to, but when you notice that it rings true of 1940s debates, I think that's accurate. When I first came across it, it reminisces the Federalist debates. Madison's if all men were angels, we would need no government. The existence of knaves in our population means that we need a government, but we don't have a separate society of angels to staff the government with. If we had a government made of angels, then we wouldn't need constitutions. So in many ways, I mean, one interpretation could be say like nihilistic or anarchistic perspective. Another is to recognize that the role of statesmanship and constitutional craftsmanship is about designing and leveraging checks and balances on government. And therefore, again, in a world, so I mean, some of the quotes that I've put up with regard to Rogie and Van Sickle and Rako, this recognition that classical liberalism takes a sort of flawed nature of humanity at its core is really important to recognize, because even with that flawed nature, there's a great potential to free association. And it's almost like there's a scarcity of trust and faith in the potentials of free association. If that declines, you're necessarily going to pour that level of trust into an alternative avenue, mainly governmental functions, and vice versa. So if we treat government as a vending machine, right, that sort of delivers goodies, it's half the story in terms of government's potential for risking or jeopardizing the autonomy and the independence that may be crucial to the functioning innovation and advancement and progress of our different social institutions, education, I think, being potentially one of them.
Agreed. And also one of the big themes I saw was the trading of security for our freedom and liberty. And especially if you look at the Patriot Act and certain things, obviously post 1958, right? When Why Liberty was written, people were more than happy to do that. Mm-hmm. And that's kind of bothersome in ways. But
I mean, I first attended graduate school in 2004, and I was a sophomore in undergrad when 9/11 occurred. And the discourse, I mean, that was when I was sort of first exposed to things like the Federalist debates or like essays like Goodrich's Why Liberty. And I couldn't help myself but be like, this is the conversation I just had on the bench about how to react to the crisis of 9/11 and the threats of terrorism versus security and privacy in terms of surveillance and all these things. So, I mean, again, there's no new things under the sun per se. These are very, very old discussions. It gives a strong reason to read old literature and have a well-rounded appreciation for intellectual history and the social sciences.
Thank you, Professor D'Amico. We have a couple questions in here, so I want to make sure we get to all of them. We have a question that says, do you see the current administration as pursuing Goodrich's God state, in quotes?
I'm not sure. I mean, I think that it is truly exceptional for Wabash College to have the courage to sponsor and showcase an institute like the one that I direct, Stephenson Institute for Classical Liberalism. It says something very remarkable about its own intellectual heritage. I can't speak for the intellectual commitments of faculty or administrators per se, and I think that there's a strong openness and appreciation of plural perspectives baked into the academic mission of any liberal arts institution, including Wabash. And I think hard conversations of disagreeing perspectives on key social issues is alive and well. I mean, I've been to many campuses across our country and spoken to many students and faculty alike. And while they have a great appreciation for liberal arts in an ideal form, they can't help but think that their own institutions are sort of crumbling and waffling and a mere shadow of themselves of the past. But since arriving at Wabash College, I would say liberal arts is alive and well here in Crawfordsville, Indiana.
Awesome. Thank you. So we have a question that says, in the Goodrich Hall Wall of Fame of liberal thinkers, who could possibly be added under the 1800s and 1900s?
I mean, I think Mary Wollstonecraft, I think Frederick Douglass would make an obvious contribution. I think F.A. Hayek, I think the entire Austrian school, Ludwig von Mises. I think, I mean, again, Ludwig von Mises has a quote that's actually my favorite quote about this intellectual vision, which is that liberalism is not a fixed ideology, right? It's not a set of policy positions. It's the application of science to the social life of man. And in many ways, this is what I think is a sort of flawed feature of the general disciplinary project of political theory or political philosophy, that in a way there's a sort of secret implicit constructivism that if you want to know, it's almost like reading the back of a baseball card, right? You have a player and they have stats. So intellectuals do this about societies. Like, we have a society. What does its legal system look like? What does its economy look like? What does its election political system look like? And political theorists sort of fill out the checklist, and political philosophers sort of fill out the checklist. Liberalism kind of doesn't fit in all the checklists because it's very much saying that lots of things could happen and we don't really know which ones are necessarily going to occur. So I think that, again, Mises and the Austrians would definitely deserve a significant place on this wall, and that their approach was really like, how do we do this systematically? How do we do this scientifically? How do we prove this concept of cause and effect relationships from individual freedom to the sort of outcomes of social operation and dynamics that occur in the real world?
Awesome. Thank you. We have two more questions and then a couple announcements. But when Trippitt Hall was designed, it housed the Center for Inquiry in the Liberal Arts. Did that center contribute anything significant to the college or to the study of liberal arts?
That's an excellent question. I think that initiative is still undergoing. My understanding was that it was a sort of data repository for informing liberal arts institutions about sort of meta trends in higher education and like pedagogical strategies. I'm not intimately familiar with the internal history of that center, but I've visited their website and seen some of their work, and it's sort of um, super relevant to like we're living amidst a radically changing higher education environment. We have demographic shifts occurring in terms of enrollment. We've had major changes in curricular majors. I mean, if you had said that computer science would be a standard curriculum in as many institutions as it is today 30 years ago, I think you wouldn't have necessarily seen that coming. So um, I think that the findings and the project that that center was founded upon and pursued is definitely worthwhile.
Awesome. Thank you. And then this is the last question I'm going to read, but Professor D'Amico is CC'd on the email that all of you got with the reminder about this talk. So I'm sure that he would be open, Professor D'Amico, not to speak for you, but if you have more questions or would like to discuss anything we talked about farther, he would definitely be open to conversing more with you. So last question is the economic department at Wabash using Paul Hines' The Economic Way of Thinking? If not, why not?
I'm not sure if the econ department has a standard text for principles. I do know that Professor Snow teaches excerpts from it because he's asked me to cover class and I've seen his syllabus. Um, I would imagine a principles curriculum designed to equip students with certain technical models for upper level or graduate work might be more standard, and that's very common throughout the profession. And so I can't speak for my colleagues in the econ department on that margin. But I love the Betke Hain Prochitko book. I've taught out of that myself several times. I assign certain readings. I think its recognition of social order as the motivating question for economic sciences is spot on. I've had the opportunity to sort of speak truth to power to Gregory Mankiw, the top-selling textbook author, and he even conceded that that text is often on certain margins superior to his own. So I took that as a grand victory in real time when it happened.
Awesome. Well, thank you. And thank you everyone for being here with us tonight. We just have a couple more announcements for you. First of all, my colleagues have been doing some amazing work on this, so I definitely wanted to make sure I shared this information. Some of you may have heard already, but in case you haven't, Wabash's 2025 Day of Giving is next Wednesday, April 30th. The theme is going to be Sing Thy Praises, commemorating 125 years of the lyrics of the Wabash fight song, Old Wabash. So we look forward to seeing you joining the chorus with us and singing Wabash's praises online with your gifts that support our students and programming like this. And speaking of generosity, Dean of Advancement, Michelle Jansen, is on this call right now, and she's going to introduce a special guest that got to join us tonight.
So, first of all, I think we all need to give a big Wabash round of applause to Dr. D'Amico, who has become a colleague as well as a friend. He's taught me so much about classical liberalism. He gets tired of me reading an article in the New York Times and saying, "What would a classical liberal think of this?" So, could we all just give a clap on our Zoom screens for Dan? Excellent job, colleague.
Thanks.
And
Michelle.
then you're welcome. And I'm so privileged. We've talked about some giants tonight, and a giant that is actually on the Zoom on his iPad and ask a good question at the start of the Q&A is alumnus Richard J. Stephenson. Dick's on the Zoom, and we're just so proud of the Institute and what it's bringing to Wabash College. And we want to thank you, sir. And so if we could all, again, just give a round of virtual applause to Dick Stephenson, some little giant.
Awesome. Thank you, everyone, again for joining us. And we hope to see you at the next one of these. So have a great rest of your week.